Over the last weekend, I reposted a meme that had been circulating around with my own little commentary on it. And it drew a lot of comments and sparked a good bit of discussion and got me thinking that it was about time that I tackled this topic head on and gave you my take and my advice about it. And so this is really oriented towards people who either put out or reproduce or accept other people's, let's call them linear chronologies of what you have to read in philosophy. So the meme itself will give you some idea about this. It begins, it's got a guy who's reading a text, and it says, reading Plato so that I can understand Aristotle, so I can understand Kant, so I can understand Hegel, so I can understand Marx, so I can argue with strangers on the internet. And you might have seen it. And what is the general idea there? That you read one philosopher primarily so that you can understand another philosopher. And the implication is that if you haven't read this earlier person, who the later person is influenced by or responding to, or their thought is formed by, well, then you can't make any sense of the later thinker. And now notice that there's a big gap here. Plato, Aristotle, okay, two big heavy hitters of ancient philosophy, and then jump right to Kant, to Hegel, and then to Marx, right? So some very, late 18th century to mid 19th century thinkers that are held to be important as well. And now my comment, and it was very tongue-in-cheek, was imagine thinking you can just skip over everything from Aristotle to Kant. Total newbie mistake. Now, the newbie thing there was deliberately meant. There's a lot of people who think that, well, you don't have to read medieval philosophy or even, Hellenistic and imperial Roman philosophy. You don't need to read Renaissance philosophy, early modern philosophy, and maybe just read some Descartes and maybe some Locke, and you're good to go, right? And there were some people who were going to, take it in that way and try to fill in the gaps. There were other people who took it in the strange direction of opining about whether it is fruitful or not to argue with people on the internet. That's a total side issue. I kind of don't care about that as far as this topic goes, because the interesting response or set of responses that I got from so many people was to be very serious and very earnest about, no, you have to read this person. You must read this person. Don't leave this person out. And that wasn't the point of this. In some respect, it's to say, hey, if you're gonna take a wrong-headed approach to figures in the history of philosophy, at least don't jump over, 1,500, more than, actually almost 2 millennia of time, right? Maybe read some of the other people along the way. But it's also wrong-headed to think that we should come up with ideal reading lists in these sorts of chains. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. And I will mention that some of what I'm going to talk about here probably will intersect or overlap with some remarks that I've made in earlier quick takes videos, specifically number 5, where people are, worried about being well-read, where I said, listen, nobody's actually that well-read. You can't possibly read it all. Number 8, adopting healthy skepticism with sweeping philosophical claims. One of those sweeping philosophical claims is, if you haven't read X, you can't understand Y, right? That is a big, big claim. The burden of proof is always on the person who is making that. And then, maybe number 10, should I study philosophy in chronological order? And, my answer to that is, well, it can't hurt you, but you don't have to feel like you have to proceed in lockstep and read everything. We begin with the pre-Socratics, and must start with the earliest of them before we go to the later ones. And then we'll read Plato, and then only after that Aristotle, and then only after that Epicurus. That's a silly approach in philosophy, to restrict yourself in that way. And we'll talk a little bit about why people come up with this sort of stuff towards the end of this video. So coming back to the main point here. So we got a lot of responses where people wanted to say, you're right. You can't just read Plato to understand Aristotle, to understand Kant. You also, if you want to understand Kant, you must read Hume and René Descartes. And if you want to read René Descartes, you must read the Scholastics. I mean, it's not completely true about that either, for reasons that we'll talk about. And so what is this kind of rigid, lockstep, must read this if you want to read this? What's actually going on there? Is that actually true of most philosophers that we're interested in, that are part of what we call the canon, very broadly speaking? And the answer is no. You don't actually have to read in that way, and you don't have to put up with other people telling you that that's the way it has to be done, that you can't possibly understand, for example, Kant without reading Hume, because Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber. I mean, if you want to know about that, that's already in Kant. Kant tells you about that. He gives you summaries of what he thinks Hume has right and what he has wrong. So, that's a good case in point. And I will call this a sort of oversimplistic philosophy 101 bad teaching approach to understanding philosophers. And it doesn't always have to be academic philosophy. It can be people arguing on the internet who are, in the forever arguing with each other, Marxist circles, saying, you can't understand Marx unless you've read Hegel, man, and you can't understand Hegel unless you've read Kant, and maybe some Aristotle as well, because Aristotle's pretty important in certain respects. So, or, people always wanting to bring up Martin Heidegger, who's a very important philosopher, said that you can't understand Nietzsche unless you've read Aristotle for 10 years. And that's complete BS. I mean, Heidegger's a really interesting figure, but every once in a while, Heidegger says things that are just complete nonsense, and he knew better at the time. He's kind of trying to be a smart guy, elitist, and then other people picked up on that because it made them, it gave them something to strive for, made them feel cool if they'd been reading Aristotle that long. But in point of fact, it's not true at all, or else we would never understand any philosophers whatsoever. So it's kind of a, philosophy 101 textbook, bad encyclopedia of philosophy, bad history of philosophy take that a lot of people, maybe believe or put forward because it's a way of making sense of a very complex field, but it's not really doing anybody any favors. And I think that if we're smart, we probably should, first of all, protect ourselves against it by saying, hey, we push back on that, but not telling students or beginners this kind of silly nonsense. If you want to understand Hegel, you absolutely must have read Kant. As somebody who works on Hegel, specifically on the phenomenology, although I'm interested in other works, I often get people saying, you can't possibly understand Hegel's phenomenology unless you've read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And that's just not true. It's not the case. As a matter of fact, there's parts of the phenomenology where clearly Kant is in the background, but it ain't the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason. Think about the morality section. What is he talking about there? Well, you probably need to have read the second critique, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, that would help you out. But you could also read that morality section without having read those works. So let's talk about individual philosophers. Can you actually understand them by reading their works without having read the one immediate predecessor that is supposed to be absolutely important for them? So what would be examples of this? Well, we've got some. Reading Plato in order to understand Aristotle. Can you read Aristotle without having read Plato? Yeah, you can. There's many of his works where, the stuff that he's going to reference from Plato, he's going to tell you about it. So, in the Politics, for example, would it help to have read Plato's Republic to address Aristotle's critique of it in the Politics? It doesn't hurt. As a matter of fact, there may be some things where you're like, oh, yeah, I get what he's talking about. But is it necessary? Absolutely not. Or in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle has some remarks on the Platonic form of the good early on in Book 1. Okay, where are you going to get that from? I guess Republic, Book 7, and maybe some other places as well. But you don't need to have read that in order to understand what he's talking about. Let's think about these other ones. Marx. Do you have to have read Hegel in order to understand Marx? I mean, it doesn't hurt, but it might actually confuse you more to read Hegel, depending on what you're reading. Do you have to have read Kant, whatever reading Kant means, in order to understand Hegel? Again, it doesn't hurt, but is it absolutely necessary? No. And we could go on and on and on with all sorts of interesting examples. Heidegger's Nietzsche, can you only read Nietzsche and make sense of it after you've studied Aristotle for 10 years? Clearly false, right? So there's, on its face, this is clearly something wrong. You can understand individual philosophers on their own, although you might get more out of locating them within a context. And the evidence for that is we do it all the time. I read René Descartes as an undergraduate without reading the scholastics that he's responding to and in some respects drawing on, and I could understand what he's saying. I read Nietzsche on my own without having read or appreciated Aristotle. I actually read Nietzsche before I read Aristotle, right? I read Albert Camus before I actually even read Nietzsche. And we could go on and on and on with these sorts of things. You definitely can read philosophers in their own right without having read the people that we take to be their major predecessor, right? So that's kind of an important point. Another thing to keep in mind, do philosophers have just one main predecessor? Like, let's say it is useful to read Kant before you go on and read Hegel, right? And we could also say that of Schopenhauer. If you're going to read Schopenhauer, could it be useful to read Kant? Yes. But are they the only people that you need to read? No. Who else is important for Hegel? A whole bunch of people. People from Aristotle and Plato all the way to Rousseau and Diderot and other people like that. And I'm just thinking about the phenomenology at that point. Or think about Schopenhauer. So yeah, great. It's important to read Kant, I suppose, to get some background, although Schopenhauer is giving you plenty of that in, say, World as Will and Representation. But if you want to understand Schopenhauer's moral theory, who else does he talk about? Hume is kind of important, isn't he? And other, sentimentalists. And he's going to bring up people of all different sorts. How many philosophers does Nietzsche engage with? Is Schopenhauer the absolute must-read before you go on to Nietzsche? Well, he's a person you could read, but Nietzsche's engaging with all sorts of other people as well, including Plato, right? Plato himself is giving you all sorts of references to his predecessors, and sometimes they're, accurate, and sometimes maybe less so. Aristotle begins a lot of his works by saying so-and-so said this, and so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this, and now here's what I'm thinking about these matters. So, the idea that there's like one main thinker who you have to read before you can read this next thinker, it doesn't really bear out when we read them well. And I'll give you a kind of an interesting example that we could construct that comes from the way in which philosophy often gets presented. So you all probably know about the opposition between British empiricism and continental rationalism. So who are the continental rationalists? Well, we all know that it begins with René Descartes, and then there's Benedict Spinoza, and then there's Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And those are the three people that are super, super important. Now, do you have to read Descartes before you can read Spinoza's Ethics? I mean, it's probably not going to be that helpful. Reading his other book, Principles of Cartesian Philosophy, I think that might be useful to have read some Descartes. Can you read Leibniz and make sense of what he's saying without having read Spinoza? I kind of think that you can, right? So these chains don't actually exist like that. We could say the same thing for Hume. If you want to read Hume, must you have read Berkeley or at least Locke? Well, it certainly doesn't hurt, but they're definitely not the only people they're engaging with. As a matter of fact, within that rationalist tradition, there's somebody who Hume talks about that a lot of people don't even know about, Nikolai Malebranche, right? And who is Leibniz actually engaging with? Is he engaging much with Spinoza? Not really. He's engaging with people like Malebranche and with Antoine Arnauld, who's a Cartesian, and, some of the British people like Clarke as well. So oftentimes these philosophers are not just like responding to this immediate assumed predecessor in the history of philosophy, which is a very narrowed down sort of take on the history of ideas. They're often responding to their contemporaries, to rivals, to other people that are interested in various traditions, and they're mixing and matching almost all the time. Here's another thing to keep in mind. If we did actually buy this silliness of you must read so-and-so so that you can understand this one and this one and this one, if we trace it back, we would have like an endless chain of links that presumably are all connected together, each one responding to the next and reinterpreting them. And where would we go back to? The pre-Socratics? Calling them pre-Socratics just means the people who came before Socrates. There's no doctrinal continuity. Half of these people don't know each other in any way, right? They're located in different places in the Greek-speaking world, and even if we did like trace it back to Plato and we bought into the often misinterpreted passage, all of philosophy is merely footnotes to Plato, which if you actually read Whitehead, he doesn't mean it like that, right? He actually goes on to explain what he means. I've got an article about that. I'll link to that below because it might be useful for some of you. So this whole notion of like this long chain just kind of nonsense. And, one person actually pointed out, this introduces a kind of Zenonian paradox of you can never actually get here from there because you're always finding people in between. Well, we don't actually find people in between because philosophy and its history is not purely linear in that way. Nor does it even just like have two like competing strains, like, there's rationalism and empiricism. No, it's not that simple, Or there's people who are like Plato, idealists, and they postulate some other world. And then there's people like Aristotle, as the empiricist again, looking at the real world. No, it's not that simple. The history of philosophy is this endless crisscrossing in many different vectors, not just of philosophy too, because philosophers engage with poets, engage with religious people and theologians, engage with historians, engage with rhetors, and that's just in the early period of it. Another consideration that I think might help to disabuse somebody of this is, so let's say that Kant is irreplaceable for reading Hegel. Well, which Kant? The Kant of the Critique of Pure Reason? The speculative philosophy Kant? The practical philosophy Kant? Or the much later, and kind of weird, wacky Critique of Judgment? Or some other Kant? Which one is it? I mean, people use these terms like Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, as, just labels for an incredibly vast amount of work. If you have to read Plato in order to understand Aristotle, what? Does that mean you have to read every single dialogue? Are there some that are more central and important? What if we've lost some of the ones that Aristotle was responding to? Oh, well, then we're screwed. We don't know what we're doing, right? I mean, philosophers are not just like a flavor of chocolate where you go out and you get a bar and, well, this one is milk chocolate just by itself, and this is milk chocolate with caramel, and this one is chocolate with raspberries, and this one is chocolate with almonds. No, it's more like, when we were kids, we would often go to the pizza parlor, and we wouldn't, be getting a whole pizza ourselves. So we had to come to some sort of agreement. And they would say make it half this and half that. I mean, that's a little bit more like what philosophers and their bodies of work are like. Even those who don't write a lot, Spinoza has an ethics, he has principles of Cartesian philosophy, he has the, theologico-political treatise. They're all different works, aren't they? Right? So what do we actually mean when we say you have to read Hegel to read Marx? Hegel's phenomenology? Marx doesn't appear to have, engaged with that closely. More philosophy of right and perhaps the logics, right? But we could go on and on and on with examples. You see where I'm going with this. People talk in these ways because they're turning philosophers and their bodies of work into abstractions that are not the real philosopher and texts. Another thing that I think that we should keep in mind is, let's say that, a particular philosopher is indeed indebted to one of their predecessors. How do they reinterpret them? Because they don't just slavishly follow them. Those aren't the people we read. Hegel is not just a Kantian, right? Aristotle is not just a Platonist. So, even somebody like Plutarch, who is a Platonist, is a Middle Platonist. And we could go on and on and on with that as well. So they're not just following along in grooves. The history of philosophy is this really complicated network of connections and interactions, and none of us ever gets to read everything that's in it. That goes back to that being well read. So we always need to be a little bit circumspect about this. Now, I said that I would, speculate a bit about where does this attitude come from. This might be helpful if you are yourself falling into this. It could be because everybody around you is talking, in this kind of cookie cutter way that misrepresents the relation of thinkers to each other and what it is that you need to do in order to understand important thinkers. It could also be a reflection of the ways that we often teach and present philosophy. So, you look at history of philosophy books, particularly those that are being used in an introductory way. They're often quite schematic, right? Philosophy begins here, and this person begot this person, begot this person. It's like a genealogy, right? That is not particularly productive, but there are a lot of people that are attracted to that sort of approach. And I think that one reason is because they feel a sense of fear or anxiety or insecurity about just how complicated all these things are. And it makes people feel good to be able to wrap their head around something, to feel like they have a map. And so even if it's a fake map, that's better than no map at all, isn't it, for quite a few people? I think for some people it also offers them a sense of, feeling on top of things, like they've mastered it, they really understand it. And that's a bit dangerous as well, because if you haven't, you're actually going to talk out of your butt and blather when you get into conversations and say things that are incorrect and make wrong inferences. So-and-so is derived from this, so because this philosopher says this, they must also believe that. I would say that a lot of it stems from a kind of ignorance as well, thinking that the field is much simpler than it is, and that could feed into the insecurity part, or into the liking to feel like you're in the know about it. And I would say that there's also some people who get off on that. They treat philosophy as if thinkers are prerequisites for each other. And I kind of think that this may stem from, on the one hand, other disciplines that are not philosophy, where they do work in kind of a more orderly succession, right? You take algebra before you go on to, pre-calculus and calculus, right? Makes sense. You do your calculus, and then at the very end of that, you get to differential equations. Okay, but philosophy doesn't work like that. You notice that there it's fields and not particular thinkers that we're talking about. I also think that games probably play a big role in this as well. And there's a kind of mentality that a lot of people bring out of particularly computer games, where there's like levels, and first you get to level 1, then you get some experience points, go to level 2, then you go to level 3, or you've got like tech chains. Well, first you develop this tech, and then you can develop this tech. It just does not work like that for thinkers, for writers in the field of philosophy. So if you've got that mindset, you're kind of crippling yourself. You're placing a lens or, matrix over your eyes that's going to keep you from being able to adequately read. And you're going to say some dumb stuff in the process. I think that there's probably some experts out there who like to say these sorts of things because it makes them, feel important. But the truth of the matter is, the field of philosophy, like I said, is not a linear progression. And we don't have to try to read everybody, and we're going to have to go back. I've said this many, many times. Whatever we read, we're going to have to go back and reread it. The order in which you study things is not absolutely essential. Instead, it's more important that you try to figure out what a philosopher is actually saying in their own terms. So reading Nietzsche, not as a Schopenhauerian, right? And reading Schopenhauer not as just a Kantian. And, going back even further, we could go all the way through that. So this is one of those sorts of topics where if you're falling into this, maybe this has given you some useful reflections that can help you shift out of it. I won't say snap out of it because that doesn't happen, but it might give you some things to think about that eventually will lead you to a better frame. And, if you encounter other people, now you probably have some idea why they are succumbing to this. Read Plato so that you can understand Aristotle. Read Aristotle so you can, understand Thomas Aquinas or Kant or whoever else it's going to be. Read Aristotle so you can understand Aristotle. Read Thomas Aquinas because he's interesting and worth reading. And it's cool to see what he makes of his predecessors in a very, you could say, reinterpretive way. Read Hegel because Hegel's frustrating, but also a lot of fun, right? Read Kant because Kant also is quite interesting. Probably clearer than Hegel, but equally muddy in his writing, right? We could go on and on and on. You get where I'm going with this. So, to bring this to a close, you can read philosophers in their own right and make sense of them. So if anybody's telling you, you cannot understand a major thinker unless you've read through whatever they are counting as their predecessor, we mentioned this is an abstraction, now you know they're wrong. You can read them on their own, and you can always go back and read their predecessors or their contemporaries who they're reacting to, but you don't have to feel under an obligation to do that, or as if you're doing something wrong by not buying into these linear progressions.